Hello, and welcome to the Fancy Scientist podcast. If this is the very first episode that you are tuning into and you are wondering, why Fancy Scientist? What is a Fancy Scientist? Well, you are in luck because that is exactly what we're talking about today. I've had this podcast going since 2020, and I realized that I never explained really what a fancy scientist is. So that is exactly what we're going to talk about this episode. How I became the fancy scientist, what the nickname means, and we're going to dig deeper into the meaning that I gave it, the definition, and the significance behind it, but also for the larger picture of science and why I decided ultimately to adopt this alter ego, because it really does have a profound influence on science. So you're going to learn about some of the stereotypes that scientists face and how important it is for me to break all different kinds of stereotypes. And in my case, in becoming the fancy scientist, is really an act of defiance. And it's so important that we have diversity within our field, not just with gender and race, but just in terms of the kinds of people that make up scientists. We're gonna dig into that all today. Let's just get started and jump right into it. So what is a fancy scientist? Well, you'll see that I'm a little bit more dressed up today. I do always dress up for the podcasts, but I work from home. So a lot of times I'm honestly in my workout clothes because I work out in the middle of the day. So it's nice to dress up. I even put on red lipstick. I rarely wear red lipstick, but I'm wearing a red shirt. So I thought this would be a great time to really show off this side of me. We're going to break down the name Fancy Scientist in a minute because I actually did give it a formal, I'm not going to say a definition, but components. As a scientist turned business owner, I wanted to have a really clear mission and a really strong understanding of who I am. But first, let me tell you about how I adopted the name. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can tell that I look a certain way. I wouldn't describe myself as being necessarily the most glamorous person, but I do like to dress up. I love to wear makeup. Growing up, I pretty much wore makeup as soon as I was allowed to. I remember in 6th grade, I started wearing eyeliner just because I liked it. I was always a stereotypically girly girl. I remember dressing up as a princess. When I was little, I played with Barbies. I loved Barbies and I loved My Little Ponies. I loved anything that was sparkly, pink, purple, although actually green was my favorite color. It still is my favorite color. So I just loved like all of these stereotypically girly types of things. I love fashion. I love wearing makeup. My family owns a jewelry business, so I love to wear jewelry. I love all of those things. So I got the name Fancy Scientist because when I started working with teachers, it's actually my second time working with teachers. I was a postdoc at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and I was part of a project where we were implementing citizen science research into classrooms. What that meant is we were part of this really big initiative where we had these citizen science or community science projects. And for those of you who don't know citizen or community science, it's real science, but we involve the non-professional scientific public to participate in some capacity. Usually that is in the form of data collection. The project that I was a part of, it was eMammal, and we worked with camera traps, which are triggered by heat and motion. We attached them to trees, so whenever an animal walked by, it would take a picture of the animal. And then we would use the pictures and the data associated with pictures, the date, the time, the location, to answer questions about mammal communities. As I said, we attached the cameras to trees, but quite honestly, it mostly wasn't us. It was mostly our volunteers. So when I joined eMammal, there had already been a big project that had taken place already where they worked with citizen science volunteers across 6 states in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States. They were studying the effects of hunting and hiking on mammal communities. I was brought aboard because of this grant. It was separate than eMammal, but eMammal was part of it, where the idea of the grant was to get community science into classrooms. Because in the United States, science scores are declining amongst kids. They are losing interest, and the really critical point where we can do an intervention is about middle school aged children. So I was brought in as part of this grant where we could incorporate citizen or community science into classrooms as a means for these kids to learn about science by doing real science. And that was the idea, that if they're doing real science, they are going to care about it more, they are going to connect to it more. They are going to feel that what they're doing has significance and meaning. They're not just collecting data for the sake of collecting data to write a little scientific write-up. That's what I did in school. I remember we did these experiments and I was frustrated because I'm like, why am I doing this experiment if I already know what's going to happen? When I learned in school, we would have a lecture where we learned about a concept, and then we would do a lab exercise to back up that concept. I knew what was going to happen, and that really frustrated me. So the idea of community or citizen science is that we don't know what the results are going to be. It's real science. Kids and adults can do this too. Obviously, we were working to get this into classrooms. And the data that was involved in this research was published in many different studies. I will link a couple of them here in the show notes. I was involved in this initiative where we collaborated with teachers. For 3 summers, I worked alongside 3 sets of teachers, a total of 9 teachers, to develop lesson plans that were implemented in middle school classrooms. When I was working with the teachers, I was at, as I mentioned, the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, and I worked in a fishbowl. No, I was not a goldfish or any other kind of fish, but what I meant by that is that our labs were behind glass. So the public could see us working on our research, which for me meant working at my computer a lot of the time. The public got to see us, and this was really important to me because I wanted people to see what a scientist looks like. When I was growing up, I didn't know of any scientist except for Einstein, who I think was not alive by the time that I was born. And I knew about Jane Goodall. And Jane Goodall was honestly really the only scientist I knew about. So it was really important for me to show people that I am a working scientist, that this is what a scientist looks like. In fact, in our Students Discover program, that's what it was called, we had t-shirts that said, this is what a scientist looks like. When I was working with the teachers, they were really surprised by the way I looked. And they just weren't expecting that. In fact, I remember when I was a PhD student, I started working with teachers. And the first time that I went into a classroom, I sat in the back and they knew a scientist was coming in. And the teacher was teaching. They're like, where's the scientist? I think she's supposed to be here by now. You know, he introduced me, the teacher introduced me, and I stood up and I said, it's me. And they were like, wow, I wasn't expecting you to look like that. And one of the kids said, I thought you were gonna have black hair and glasses. I don't know why black hair, but glasses, I can understand the stereotype. But anyway, they weren't expecting me to be the scientist. One of them said, oh, I thought you were like a substitute teacher or an assistant teacher. So I really like breaking these stereotypes. And when I started working with teachers at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences, because I was in this fishbowl, I would tend to dress up. And when I was in graduate school, I actually wouldn't dress up that much because I wanted to blend in more. When I worked at the museum, a lot of people dressed up, And I knew I was like on display, so I decided to dress up more. And one of the teachers said, "You're just so fancy. Like, look at you with your jewelry. You're so fancy." And they just started calling me the fancy scientist. So we all just kind of like loved that name. We thought it suited me perfectly, that it really captured my personality, and it really combined these two distinct worlds that I loved, which were science and really specifically, more than science, nature, animals, and wildlife, and fancy. And we're going to talk about like what fancy means in a little bit, but fancy for me in this moment was like sparkly things, like dressing up, like makeup, these stereotypically girl things. This was especially important being in the wildlife field, because in wildlife work, people really dress down. And it makes sense because you're going to the field, you're going outdoors. But I really wanted to combine these two different worlds, that you could go outside, get dirty, and then put on high heels, a dress, makeup, and go out. And you could be that same person. You don't have to change who you are. Both of those types of human beings can fit into one body, into one person. So that is what I really like to exude as the fancy scientist. And I actually am doing this podcast today for myself as much as for you guys. For you guys, because I noticed on my YouTube video, one of my videos, like, what is a fancy scientist, or what does it mean to be a fancy scientist, really took off. It's really popular. So I was like, oh, people are really interested in this topic. I'm going to talk more about this. But also for myself, because to be honest, I haven't been feeling like a fancy scientist lately. Ever since the pandemic happened, and the pandemic just happened to coincide with when I was already transitioning my career to becoming more of an educator rather than a research scientist. My position as a postdoc ended, so I decided to start my own business then. And I was working a lot more at home. And when you're working at home, especially when you have a bunch of animals like I do, right now I have 3 dogs and 2 cats. So there's hair everywhere. And, you know, when you're holding your cat, you don't want their claw to get at your shirt. So I dress down a lot of days. I'm doing this because I want to declare to the universe, to you guys, that I'm going to embody being a fancy scientist once again. So let's just take some time now to break down, what does it mean to be a fancy scientist? What is the definition that I created for myself, for my business, so that when I create content, I know that it is on track to be of the fancy scientist brand and vibe. Before we jump into my definition of fancy scientist, if you are liking this episode, liking this podcast, please rate and review the Fancy Scientist podcast. Give me honest feedback. This helps people find the podcast. I would greatly appreciate it. I've been doing this since 2020, and it just really helps people find this. If you're loving this episode, please share it with a friend or someone who you think it could help. Somebody who maybe they feel like they are a fancy scientist deep down inside, but they're afraid to express themselves. We'll get into that. You could change somebody's lives. You could give them the confidence, the empowerment that they need to feel to truly be themselves. Here's the fancy scientist definition that I came up with. First, let's start with scientist. So for scientists, and as it relates to my organization, this is somebody who asks good questions. They are curious, analytical, collect data, look at it objectively. For me and my brand, it's really important to love nature and wildlife. I do want to say for the science part, I want to expand beyond just strict science. When I first started out, I was a researcher conducting research, obviously, and I was talking almost exclusively about my research. But I always wanted to have more of an impact and talk more about things that affect wildlife, the environment, things that are also really empowering. If you've been following me for a while, you know that mindset is really important, that I also started talking about my career early on, that was really important, that I provided advice for people. And now I am a career mentor. So what started out with science has now expanded into careers and lifestyles. It's beyond just the strict research definition. Actually, when I first started podcasting, I talked a lot about lifestyle. I have podcast episodes on becoming a vegan, about green shopping, like purchasing from more sustainable and eco-conscious brands. I want to bring that stuff back. And if you belong to my newsletter, you will find that I talk about something that I'm loving. So I want to bring more of that to the podcast and just the website and everything in general. And as I mentioned, scientists are curious. So I love trying different products, different brands. I want to talk about these parts of my life that I am innately passionate about, which is not just science and wildlife, but the environment and things related to the environment, specifically health, eating, food, some of the companies, products I've discovered. For example, a product that I have started using and that I am really enjoying is Magic Mind. These are mental performance shots. If you have followed me, you know that I talk about mindset all the time. I have full podcast episodes devoted to mindset. And I'm going to be honest with you. I also have a podcast episode coming up about this. I have been struggling lately. You might know that I have gone off of my antidepressants. I'm fully off of them now. I've been off of them since like February, and I've been slowly tapering off for about 2 years. And there's been some life changes. My partner moved in with me that have been just triggering because there's been a lot of things going on, a lot of change for me. It's been hard for me to focus and have that clarity. When Magic Mind reached out to me to sponsor this podcast, I was like, yes, I want to try your mental performance shots because I am stressed out right now. I'm going to be honest. I'm having a hard time focusing, getting things done. So I wanted to try them. They offered to send me their mood performance shots designed to help with stress, anxiety, clarity, focus. So I have been using them now and I honestly really love them. I actually crave the flavor now. I really like it. It's like a citrusy guava flavor. It also has matcha tea in it, which I love. They also have ashwagandha in them, and I love health and fitness. I've been listening to Arnold Schwarzenegger's podcast, and I heard an episode from him where he was talking about ashwagandha. Let me read you what the studies show. Scientists did a meta-analysis where they reviewed 12 studies where ashwagandha usage varied, and it appeared to reduce stress and anxiety. It significantly reduced cortisol levels. I have been using these shots for the past 8 days. They honestly have helped my focus and clarity a lot. Let me just read you some facts about them because I know my audience is very logic-based. It's been in development for over 10 years. There are over 200 scientific studies behind every ingredient. I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes. I really wanted to make sure that I worked with quality companies. They are carbon neutral, and when you purchase their product, they donate to mental health and charities for people experiencing homelessness. They are sponsoring this episode, and you also get an amazing deal. You'll get up to 60% off if you subscribe. I mean, that is a huge deal. That's, more than half off. You'll just want to head over to magicmind.com/fancymm, and I will put the link in the show notes. In case you're driving, you do not need to write this down. If you don't want to do the subscription, you can get 20% off by just hitting the promo code FANCY20. Give them a try. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear back from you. That was all the scientist part. We are curious. We're asking questions, analyzing, investigating. We're looking at the world with open eyes. Now, the fancy part, what is this fancy part? So as I mentioned, for me, fancy meant this like more traditional sense of fancy, like glamorous, like in things that are stereotypically girly. A lot of people think that fancy means expensive. No, fancy does not mean expensive. You can go to the thrift store and find fancy clothes that are not that expensive, but think like chandeliers, sparkle, grandeur. That's what I think of when I think of fancy. But what fancy represents in terms of fancy scientist is more of that unexpected element. So we think about that I'm a wildlife biologist, that I like going outside. I'm not at all afraid to get dirty, to go to remote locations all over the world. It's more this unexpected and contradictory element. So bringing this fancy side to this clearly non-fancy side of going out into these remote areas. In fact, for my PhD project, I collected elephant dung. So these two worlds, getting them to melt. You can be a fancy scientist even if you don't like glamorous things when we take this larger approach to the word and understanding the impact that it has. It's more of this unexpected element. And why is this so important? Okay, so here's what I have for fancy. I have unexpected, unconventional, lover of beautiful things and glamour. That is, I believe, the dictionary definition of lover of beautiful things. Fun, too. Also, as a fancy scientist, I want to make things fun as well. So why is it important for me to be a fancy scientist, for people to see me in the fishbowl as a fancy scientist? Because when people see what is possible for them, then they can believe in that themselves. If there is a young girl or boy or anyone at the museum who sees somebody who they can see themselves in, then this gives them confirmation that if they want to pursue this career, that it is for them. Or not even if it's a career option, but just like that it's okay to like both of these worlds, that you belong in both of these worlds, that you can go camping, that you can go to these remote areas. And you can also do these glamorous things. You can also dress up. You don't have to choose one or the other. And this is why representation matters so much. But it also extends, obviously, like gender is really important to show gender diversity in careers so that kids can see like, oh, like, if they're a girl, women typically weren't well represented in the sciences. Now, in our field, they are pretty well represented. In other fields, they're still not well represented. Now, little girls can see people who are women working in science and be like, yeah, I can do that because I know people who have those jobs. But if they don't see that sort of representation, they might not think that that's available to them. That's why it was so important to me. And when we think about diversity, I wanted to go even beyond gender and our race. It's about the diversity of the types of people as well. I remember when I was at the museum, I talked to somebody who had a student in their lab who was a football player. So he was more of a jock or an athlete. And he had a conversation with this person. And this person didn't feel comfortable being in a lab, honestly. They didn't feel like they belonged because they weren't like stereotypically nerdy. They were more of an athlete. It's about welcoming and including people from all different walks of life. So whenever I give a talk, whenever I show up on camera, I honestly like to show this fancier side of me because I never know who's watching. And I really want to show that contradiction, that you can look a certain way and you can be a certain way, that you can be stereotypically pretty or like the pretty things and still be really smart. You can blend both of those worlds together. And that's why it's so important for me. And that's why I really wanted to do this episode declaring what is a fancy scientist. It is this unconventional bridging of two worlds that they don't need to be separate. They can be together. You can be both of these parts in the same person. We're even seeing that this representation is changing the way kids think about scientists. Before, there were studies that showed when you asked children to draw scientists, they would draw typically what like Albert Einstein looks like. So like older white men, they would often have crazy hair, they would be in laboratory coats. And now, because representation has increased, studies show that kids are actually drawing more and more women scientists, female scientists. So this is changing. And then also, we need to think about not just the diversity of the people within the sciences, we should also think about the diversity of the sciences as well. Science is not just people in a lab coat with test tubes doing studies like that. It is, of course, the wildlife world, the paleontology world. It is people going all the way to the depths of the ocean, to space. There is a huge diversity in science. So not only when kids draw scientists should we focus on increasing the diversity of like what the actual people look like, but also what kind of sciences are represented. I think that's another really important aspect as well. I want you to think about maybe you don't feel like you're a traditional fancy scientist in terms of maybe you don't love chandeliers or you don't wear sparkles or makeup or things like that. But how are you unconventional? And I want to hear from you. I want to hear from you. Like, how are you unconventional in your life? Like, what is something that is bringing these two different worlds together of science and something that seems like it doesn't belong with science? A great example of this is art and science. So many people think that art and science are separate, they're disconnected. I cannot even tell you how many of my scientist friends loved art growing up, including yours truly. I loved it. I loved drawing. I was an amazing drawer. And yeah, so many scientists out there are great artists, and art and science feed into each other really well. I did an interview with John Muir-Laws. He is a big champion of nature journaling, and this is a great example of how art and science blend together. These seemingly disconnected worlds are brought together. So moving forward, I want you to think about like, how am I being a fancy scientist? How am I being unconventional? How am I challenging the scientist stereotype? And I encourage you to do that. And when I have an About Me page and I share this stuff, and I can't tell you how many people have responded saying that they resonate with this message, that they felt like they were maybe the only ones or one of the few, and you're not. There's so many of us out there. I used to have this blog post out there, or I still have this blog post, but I used to do this series where I featured a fancy scientist every single week. I would mostly look through Twitter. Twitter was really popular then, and also Instagram, and find people of all different ages, all different genders, all different backgrounds who were being a fancy scientist. That is, in this case, it was people who were dressing up more, but it didn't have to be they were wearing makeup or that they were in sparkles. It just was like dressing up and being distinguished in some fashion. But there's so many of us. If you know somebody who is, maybe they're a fancy scientist and maybe they're afraid to show it too, that could be another part. When I was in graduate school, I actually hid this part of me. I dressed down for years because I thought that dressing up fancy, that wearing makeup, that dressing up would make me look stupid. Now, nobody ever told me this. Nobody ever said that they didn't take me seriously because I dressed up or because I looked a certain way. This was all in my head. Now, maybe some people really did think that, but I don't know. Nobody ever told me that, but that's what I thought. I changed the way I look. I dulled myself down. I dampened myself. And I realized I was, no pun intended, dulling my sparkle. I didn't feel as good. I didn't feel as confident. I feel better with makeup on. When I work here remotely, there's lots of days. I would say like 2 to 3 days out of the week, I don't put makeup on. And I feel different. I just feel like more powerful, more confident with makeup. And I understand not everyone feels that way. That's okay. But for me, I like wearing it. It makes me feel good. And I think I'm beautiful without makeup. It's not about that. It's just like I just feel better with makeup on, or I feel more confident, more powerful with makeup on. So I want you to be who you are. That's really the most important part about being a fancy scientist. But if you know somebody who is maybe feeling like they're not wanting to let that side of them show because they're worried about what other people think, please share this episode with them because you have something unique and beautiful to share with this world. It is so important that we show this diversity. And not only for the science world, but also think about the whole environmental movement, the whole conservation movement. If you show up looking a certain way for an environmental meeting, a climate change meeting, something to get like environmental action done, do you feel like people might not take you seriously because you don't look like somebody who cares about conservation? I also got that. Like, you're wasting resources putting on makeup. Well, I can tell you, I've had the same eyeshadow palette for probably longer than I should admit right now. Let's just say I moved it from Raleigh, and I moved from Raleigh 3 years ago. And even then, I probably had it for a couple of years. So yes, I am consuming, but it's not tons. I make sure to use all of my makeup. You can be both. We're all consuming on this planet and we all like to lessen our impact. And again, that goes back to the companies that I care about. That goes to shopping for companies that are B corporations that care about the environment, that care about improving the planet, that care about doing good. Like Magic Mind, they donate towards mental health causes to people who are experiencing homelessness. We get to choose who we invest our money with, and that makes an impact. That is what a fancy scientist is. So think about how and where you are being a fancy scientist in your life. Make sure that you share with me. And if you need some help, check out that John Muir Laws podcast episode that I talked about. If you're on YouTube, I will put that next in the rotation. And make sure you get that huge discount off of Magic Mind to try it out. It's up to 60% off. Just go to magicmind.com/fancy scientist. You can also enter discount code FANCY20 to get 20% off if you're just going to do a one-time purchase. It is a deal too great to pass up, and let me know what you think about it.